All right, everybody. This week we are going over Unit 5, Chapter 3, where we will talk about plant diversity. As always, if you click on this link, you will get a copy of the guided notes, which you can turn in at a later date for extra credit. These little Easter eggs here are fun little songs where the song is based on what we're learning this week, so they're just a fun little Easter egg. All right, so last week we talked a little bit about green algae, but the type of algae that we talked about was mainly single cells or maybe colony forming cells. They were not true plants. This week we're going to be talking about true plants, and one of the plants that we're going to talk about are chlorophyta or green algae like sea lettuce. Now, sea lettuce or green algae that is a true plant like chlorophyta can do all the things plants can do. They can photosynthesize, they have a green pigmentation, they have a cellulose cell wall, but they are water or aquatic plants. The plants that are closest to land plants, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about, are the charophytes. It is a type of streptophyte, but it contains both chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And they can store carbohydrates as starch. So they're very similar to land plants, and they are true plants. Now, why do you think plants evolved to move onto land? Or what kinds of adaptations did they have to overcome to be able to live on land? So here we have our little charophyte right here, this water plant, and you can see some of the evolutionary branches to get all the way to flowering plants. Flowering plants, known as angiosperms, are some of the last plants to evolve in the Cretaceous period. All these other plants have been around for quite a while, but what kinds of things makes them unique and distinctive as compared to algae? So what is different about this plant and all of these plants? Well, one difference is they had to come up with adaptations to avoid desiccation or drying out. They also had to have structural support to be able to grow taller than a few centimeters. They're going to go through different adaptations to capture sunlight. Depending on the environment that they live on, this can look very different, including producing different pigments or having different shaped leaves. They also need to disperse their reproductive cells. And speaking of reproductive cells, seeds were really great development for gymnosperms and angiosperms because it allowed the seeds to live in places that you normally would not be able to disperse your offspring, your genetic offspring. So early land plants, they did not have the structural support that trees do, so they are very small and they stay close to the ground. They also did not have as much of the protection from drying out, so they're normally going to live in moist, shady areas. As they developed more rigid molecules, the stems were able to grow taller and expand to catch more sunlight. And then, of course, seeds were developed, allowing them to populate more inhabitable areas and broader areas. The vascular tissue was very, very important because without vascular tissues, the plants could not transport water from the roots to their leaves. And this brings us to xylem and phloem. We're going to talk in detail about xylem and phloem today, so just lock those words away and save them for later. They are the vascular tissues of plants. All right, some other adaptations. We need to protect our leaves from drying out or desiccation. One great adaptation for this is called the waxy cuticle. This is especially prominent in desert plants like cacti. And it is a waxy secretion on top of the upper epidermis of the plant. So if you've ever seen a cactus or eaten a cactus, it has a waxy layer on top. That's intentional. It's there to protect the plant from drying out. But the waxy cuticle is not permeable to gases, so they had to have another adaptation to allow the plant to do gas exchange. And so we have these little pores at the bottom called stoma, and that allows gas to get inside or allows carbon dioxide air to get inside and allow photosynthesis to take place because plants need CO2 for photosynthesis. They also can produce different pigments and flavors. Flavonoid flavors or pigments will allow it to not only protect itself from damage by UV radiation, but the different pigments can help in different ways, as well as flavonoids, which allow plants to have a flavor, which can be a positive thing for animals where, you know, the plant tastes really good, or it could be a negative thing. Maybe the plant is very bitter and it will help the plant avoid animals eating it. Now, this can go even further. The plant can produce alkaloids or other chemicals which don't just have a bitter flavor, but can also be poisonous. So there are many different kinds of poisonous plant, like the deadly nightshade, the oleander, which actually grows around here, the daffodil. Those are all plants that could kill you. This helps the plant prevent predation. So it's discouraging predators from eating it. And a predator could be just a cow eating the grass. Other types of plants went the opposite direction. Instead of being poisonous or bitter, they became super delicious. They developed fruits, and the fruits hold the seeds. So when the animal eats that fruit, it will walk miles or yards or any kind of distance away and poop, and the seeds will be in that poop, allowing the plant to develop in this new area. And flowers. Flowers are evolved to attract insect pollinators. So they also evolved in coevolution with insects. All right, we're going to learn a bunch of different names of a bunch of different plants. This diagram here is a little bit boring, but I liked it because it had the charophytes over here on the side. These are your water plants. They are the most closely related type of green algae or water plant to land plants. But we're going to learn about the land plants today. So if you click on this image, you will go to an interactive of all of these land plants. When you hover over these items, it will give you more information about those plants. All of this information is testable, so you do need to know all of these different families of plants. For instance, the plant kingdom can be divided into two major groups, the non-vascular plants or the bryophytes, and the vascular plants or the tracheophytes. It's named tracheo after the trachea of insects, which are just spherical tubes. So their names kind of make sense. One of the groups of non-vascular plants is called Bryophyta. This is your mosses. They are pretty much constrained to being only a few millimeters tall, and they live in shady, moist areas, which allows them to absorb water directly because they do not have a root system and they do not have vascularization, so no xylem and phloem. Same thing with the hornworts. You can see a picture of this person's finger, so they're only a couple centimeters tall. They're not going to get any bigger than that. And the liverworts actually have a large, broad, flat leaf, but again, there's no root system and there's no shoot system. It's just leaves. They do have some proto-root called a rhizoid, which is a very small root, but it's made out of the same kinds of cells that you find in the leaves. So it's not very good at its job, but it does provide some attachment to the ground and some absorption of water and nutrients. All the other plants are going to be vascular plants. We can divide the vascular plants into two major groups, the seed-producing plants or spermatophytes, or the spore-producing plants called pteridophytes. Now, the word pterido is the same as pterodactyl. So I remember these as being kind of ancient plants. They were around before the time of the dinosaurs, but if you've ever seen, Jurassic Park or a picture of dinosaurs, you'll notice these kinds of plants a lot, like ferns. Ferns reproduce using a spore system. They actually alternate between a gametophyte and a spermatophyte like life cycle, but they produce these zygotic spores. And the spores are pretty unprotected, so the game is a numbers game. They're not going to be able to grow in places that are not super favorable, so you're only going to find these kinds of plants in really moist areas. And like I mentioned, they don't produce seeds. They just release the spores directly from underneath their leaves, and they can only go as far as the wind takes them. If they land in a bad spot, they don't grow, they die. If they land in a good spot, then they can grow. There is also other types of pteridophytes, not just the ferns, but there are also horsetails. They're bushy looking tails of the pteridophytes. Club mosses look kind of similar to the horsetails. They do not produce seeds, they produce spores, and they come out of these little cones. So the club moss is also a spore producing plant. Now, seed producing plants or spermatophytes can be divided into two major groups: the angiosperms, which produce flowers, or the gymnosperms that do not produce flowers. The gymnosperms include conifers or the pinophytes, like pine trees, anything with a cone, and needle-like leaves. Normally, these are evergreens. Some of them can grow very, very tall. So they were part of this like great tree race. Everything wanted to be really tall to catch as much sunlight as possible and disperse their seeds on the wind as much as possible. So that is how these pinophytes or conifer trees developed. We also have cycads. They look kind of like palm trees, but they are not true palm trees. Palm trees live in this family right here. If you've ever had a sago palm, again, not a palm tree. It is a cycad. This is a picture of a sago palm. Other examples are these like squat looking trees with these large fronds. They do not produce flowers. They reproduce with these cones. The last group is the ginkgo. Now, ginkgo is an entire group, but it's also the name of one single tree because there is only one species of ginkgo tree, the Ginkgo bilboa, that is still living. All the others have gone extinct, but it used to be a really big phyla that existed a lot around the time of the dinosaurs. So if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, you probably saw lots of these cycads and maybe a few different kinds of ginkgos, but now there's only one. And they're really popular because they're beautiful trees. They don't produce flowers. And so during the fall, they will turn golden yellow. Very beautiful trees. But they don't live in the wild. They only live in cultivated areas. The other group, angiosperms, what makes them unique is that they produce flowers. Now, this is the biggest phyla of all of the plant kingdom. In fact, all the other species combined does not amount to how many angiosperms there are. So if you're thinking of a plant just at random, you are most likely thinking of an angiosperm. Their angiosperms come in two forms, the monocots and the dicots. Now, monocots are named monocots because they have one cotyledon. The cotyledon is like a little leaf that is inside of the seed. Now, seeds are really, really helpful for these plants. Now, conifer seeds and cycad seeds, they do have seeds, but they're a little bit different than the angiosperm seeds. The conifers and the cycads kind of rely on the seeds just to fly wherever they go. But the flowering plants co-evolved with animals. And so one of the things that they have is they have all this nutrients inside of their seed, which allows the seed to kind of grow in areas that it normally wouldn't be able to. If it lands in an area that's kind of dry, it will start using this for nutrients and it will grow later on, maybe after it rains. But monocots only have one cotyledon. They also tend to have fibrous roots, and their xylem and phloem, or their vascular tissue, is scattered. There's no pattern. It's just kind of all over the place inside of the stem. Their leaves are normally long blade-like leaves, and the venation is straight or parallel. So this includes your true palms, your bananas, your birds of paradise, your lilies, your grains. So things like an orchid is going to be a monocot. Things like corn and wheat are going to be monocot. The flowers that they produce always have multiples of 3 petals. So like an orchid, like I mentioned, has 3 distinct petals. Lilies tend to have 6 petals, so a multiple of 3. Now, everything that you know about monocots apply that to dicots. Di means two, so they have two cotyledons. Now, normally they have a thick taproot, which means it is a thick central root that goes deep, and the fibrous roots come off of that. That means many of our vegetables, like ginger and potatoes and carrots, they're going to be dicots. Any fruit that is produced is going to be a dicot. Well, not any fruit. We have some fruit that's over here. Most fruit. I am so sorry, I misspoke. Most fruit and peas that we eat are going to be dicot. There are a few fruits over here in the monocot family. I digress. The leaves are normally going to be broad and flat with branched veining. The flowers are not going to be multiples of 3, so normally there's 4 or 5 petals, but sometimes many, many petals, such as the roses or sunflowers. And their vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, are highly organized. So make sure that you become familiar with all of these different families and phyla of plants. All right, looking at this image, which one is a gymnosperm? Well, if we look back on our previous page, we know that gymnosperms are going to not produce flowers, but they do produce seeds, normally in the form of a cone. So right away I see these cones, I know that this is a gymnosperm, and I can confirm that it's a gymnosperm because of the needle-like leaves. But there's one little sneaky gymnosperm in here. We'll come back to it in a second. So there actually are 2 gymnosperms in this image. This is one of them. This one says, which one is a dicot angiosperm? Angiosperms are flower-producing plants. And remember, monocots, the flowers come in multiples of 3, like a lily. But a dicot does not behave that way. They're normally going to have broad leaves and branched features. So we're talking about this tree right here. It is a dicot angiosperm. All right, a pteridophyte. Remember, pterodactyl. Pteridophytes are spore-producing plants. They are vascular. They do have xylem and phloem, but they produce spores, not seeds. So this little horsetail fern is going to be our pteridophyte or spore-producing plant. All right, bryophyte. Bryophyte are the mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. So this is your moss, and it is a bryophyte. All right, now I told you that there was a sneaky gymnosperm in here somewhere, and here it is. It's asking you to circle the plant that is a gymnosperm, but it's not a conifer, and it's not a cycad, so it's not going to have big prominent cones or needle-like leaves. What I'm asking for is the ginkgo tree. So here's a picture of a ginkgo leaf. Very distinctive. It is the only one in the world like it. All right, we learned about a couple different families of plants, but now let's just talk about the general structure of plants. For the most part, we're going to be talking about angiosperms just because they are the most common type of plant. Plants have 3 main parts, I guess: the root system, the shoot system, and the reproductive system. The root system, of course, includes the roots. The shoot system includes this vegetative material like the leaves and the stem. And then the reproductive system is, of course, your flowers and fruits. Anything that produces seeds. So if we're talking about conifers, the reproductive system would be the cones. Now, I want to talk about different types of tissues and where you're going to find them in this plant. The epidermis is exactly what it sounds like. Epi means outside. So the epidermis is the layer of cells that is on the outside. Now, the epidermis is over the entire plant, but it's going to behave differently in different parts of the plant. For instance, the leaf is going to have an epidermis that has stoma on the bottom and a waxy cuticle on the top. But the roots are going to have an epidermis that is involved in absorbing nutrients and water. And so the epidermis in the roots is really focused on having as much surface area as possible. Whereas the epidermis on the leaves doesn't necessarily care about surface area except for photosynthesis. It cares more about retaining water. Vascular tissues are mainly going to be your xylem and phloem. Again, lock those away. We're going to talk about them when we talk about stems. There is xylem and phloem inside of the root, and there is xylem and phloem inside of the leaves, but we're mainly going to talk about the xylem and the phloem inside of the stem. And then ground tissue is just this catch-all phrase. It is responsible for metabolism in the leaves. This is called mesophyll. It is responsible for support and structure in the stem. And the ground tissue is responsible for storage of starches and sugars, really throughout the plant, but mainly in the root. All right, let's talk about leaves. We just need some random vocabulary to be able to talk about leaves in the future. So the midrib is going to include xylem and phloem, but also lots of structural cells for support. And then coming off of the midrib are going to be the veins. These veins are going to help you identify leaves during lab, but what they do for the leaf is they house the xylem and phloem, because remember, the leaf needs water from the xylem, and the leaf is going to produce sugars that go into the phloem. So we need both xylem and phloem in these veins. The margin is the edge. The shape of the margin is important and can help you identify leaves. We'll go over those in a second. And then we have the petiole. The petiole is going to be the part that the leaf sticks to the stem. If there is no petiole and the leaf is attached directly to the stem, we call it sessile. So sometimes we have multiple petioles attached to the same point, and we'll talk about what that is when we talk about the shapes of leaves. But in the meantime, let's talk about the general structure of a leaf. The purpose of a leaf is to undergo photosynthesis. So its entire structure is contingent on that fact. It wants to produce sugars by photosynthesis. So there's several things, if you think back to biology 1, that we need for photosynthesis. We need carbon dioxide. We need to get rid of oxygen. We need water, but not too much water. And we need sunlight. So we need all of those ingredients in order to photosynthesize. Leaves have 2 layers of epidermis. The upper epidermis is going to be more focused on producing that waxy cuticle. And right underneath it is going to be the palisade mesophyll. But the upper epidermis is going to be just 1 layer of cells, if possible, because we don't want to block the sunlight from reaching the mesophyll. The lower epidermis is very similar to the upper epidermis. It does excrete a little bit of a waxy cuticle, but its main purpose is to have these stoma, these holes that allow carbon dioxide to enter and allow oxygen to escape. So lots of gas exchange is happening inside of the leaves. Leaves breathe. Now, let's talk about mesophyll. Mesophyll is the ground tissue of the leaf. It is the part of the leaf that is actually doing a job. Well, I mean, I guess producing a cuticle and having stoma is a job. So I misspoke. But the mesophyll is what's responsible for photosynthesis. So what we have is the upper mesophyll, or the palisade mesophyll, is going to be packed full of chlorophyll. This is where most photosynthesis is going to take place, and you can see in this electromicrograph that it's highly organized. Underneath it is the spongy mesophyll. The spongy mesophyll is, as the name implies, this sponge-like shape. This allows for tons and tons and tons of gas exchange. So we have evaporation of water happening here, we have the absorption of CO2, and we have the release of oxygen. So lots of gas exchange is happening here. This is also pulling double duty in aquatic plants because it helps the leaves to become buoyant. I don't like that it says the word float, because not all aquatic plants float on the surface of the water. But the leaves still need to be buoyant, otherwise they would kind of sink and not be able to absorb as much sunlight. They need to fan out and be buoyant. And having little pockets of CO2 or oxygen here really, really help the aquatic plant do that. All right. Why do you think land plants have so many different colors? Because if we're talking about aquatic plants pretty much only have chlorophyll. They do have other pigments as well, but the main one is chlorophyll. Once plants made that move onto land, all these other pigments started showing up. We have carotenoids that have an orange pigmentation, and they're really good at photosynthesizing right here in this blue wavelength, just like chlorophyll is. Then we have this red pigmentation, and it's really good at photosynthesizing right here in this green and yellow area. Then we have phycocyanin, a blue pigment, and it's really good at photosynthesizing in this orange area. And then, of course, we have chlorophyll again, which has a second spike down here in the red area. So why do you think this is happening? Well, some of the answer choices are, well, maybe the leaves are being protected from harmful radiation like UV rays, which is true. We already talked about that. These are helpful for protecting against harsh radiation. Maybe they are to adjust to different wavelengths of light. Well, yeah, that sounds right, because this is showing exactly that, how these different pigmentations absorb different wavelengths of light. And maybe it has something to do with taking advantage of the low sunlight in winter months. And also the angle of the sun during the winter is different and may not be these normal blue waves and may have more of these longer wavelengths. And the answer to this question is all of the above. Those are all really good reasons why plants may have some different pigmentations, especially during different times of the year. Not all plants are really good at producing these pigments, though. Some plants have kind of de-evolved. They usually live in really shady areas where there's not as much sunlight, like these parasitic plants. The parasitic plants are mostly going to be climbing vines, and if they're climbing on a bigger tree, that tree is going to shade the climbing vine. So the climbing vine can't rely on photosynthesis alone for production of food. It also has to steal some food from the larger plant that it's parasiting over. So they're going to focus more on their root system and having a unique root system that not only climbs and grabs onto the tree that it's parasiting, but also sucks the nutrients out of it. Since they don't rely on photosynthesis for their main food source, they're not only autotrophic, but they're also heterotrophic and parasitic. So they just don't have to focus on photosynthesizing as much, and they live in the shade. So they don't produce as many pigments as normal plants do. Some of them that we'll talk about later don't produce pigments at all. All right, finishing up talking about leaves. Leaves come in many different shapes and sizes. So there are different types of veins. These veins look very organized, whereas these look more branched. And then this blade-shaped leaf, the veins are all parallel. This is distinctive of a monocot, a grain or a grass or a palm. These are indicative of the dicot angiosperms. There are different shapes of leaves. All of these look like angiosperms, dicot angiosperms. If it has a distinctive shape, this can help us identify it, like this redbud leaf. But looking at this leaf, it's very different than the others. This is a needle-like leaf. It still does photosynthesis, but it's very narrow and has a thick waxy cuticle. This is indicative of a gymnosperm, particularly a conifer or a pinophyte. We also have different leaf arrangements. If a leaf connects to the stem by itself, just one, we call it a simple leaf. But if we have multiple leaves connecting to the stem at one place, it is called a compound leaf. Sometimes a compound leaf is in this pattern, and in other plants it's more like this, where the branches are mirror images of each other. Now, there can be two different arrangements of this kind of compound leaf. If the leaves come off at the same point every single time, they are called opposite. But if they take turns coming off of the stem, we call that alternate. And that can also help us identify plants that look very similar. The margin or the edges are normally smooth, but some of them are serrated or tooth-like, and some of them are lobed, like this oak leaf here. And then we see some that are whorls, but not very commonly. This looks like a charophyte, which is a water plant. All right, we're done talking about leaves. Let's talk about stems. I'm not going to spend very long on stems. Nodes of the stem is where the branches come off, or where the stem, the leaves come off. So these branches are attached to the main stem at a node. If this is a node and this is a node, then what is in between? An internode. That's about as much as we need to know. Then we have axillary buds. This is an area on the node that is going to produce new leaves or a new flower. Like this is a bud where new growth is happening, because plants grow in all directions all at once, including the apical bud, which is going to be the very top of the stem. The apex, or the tip of the shoot, is going to have an apical meristem. And we'll talk about meristems more when we talk about roots, because plants also are growing down at the same time that they're growing up. They're also growing out, but I digress. Now, the ground cells inside of the stem are different than the ground cells inside of the leaf. In the leaf, the ground cells were all mesophyll. In the stem, the ground cells are mainly focused on support. So there are three kinds of different ground cells inside of the stem. You have parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. I have no words of wisdom on how to memorize these. Parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma. They just sound funny and they're fun to say. So that's as much comfort as I can offer you. Parenchyma are going to be like your plant stem cells. They are undifferentiated cells that are just kind of hanging around, waiting to be needed. So, for instance, if they're located near a bud, the parenchyma may differentiate into a leaf cell or a flower cell. If there's damage on the stem, the parenchyma is there to repair the damage. Then we have sclerenchyma. Sclerenchyma is an extremely strong type of ground cell. It is entirely focused on support and upwards, growing taller. You'll mainly find the sclerenchyma around the vascular tissue, surrounding the xylem and the phloem. They're so strong, they have two walls. They have a primary and a secondary cell wall, two cell walls. Then we have collenchyma. Collenchyma is kind of in between the parenchyma and the sclerenchyma, but it does have a thick cell wall. It doesn't have two cell walls. It just has an extra thick cell wall, whereas the parenchyma has a thin cell wall. So we have parenchyma, sclerenchyma, and in between is collenchyma. Here is a picture of a cross section of a stem. So if you look down into the plant, here we can very easily see the vascular tissue. This is xylem, this is phloem, but there's also these other types of pigmented cells, which we've dyed. You're identifying the vascular bundle right here. Here's the epidermis, and in between the epidermis and the vascular tissues, we have these different kinds of collenchyma, sclerenchyma, and parenchyma. And you can see that they're shaped very different. The sclerenchyma is kind of arranged in these rings. The parenchyma is these big hollow type cells. So definitely some differences there. Just parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma. These are the ground cells of the stem. Now, I know I said that I would be talking about vascular tissue over and over and over again. Let's watch this video. All right, so how did the beads get pulled up into the air? What is the power that is driving them to be pulled up into the air and out of the beaker that he was holding? Well, gravity was pulling that first bead, but then the first bead was pulling the second bead, which was pulling the third bead, which was pulling the fourth bead, so on and so forth, until there was so much force that the beads were kind of whipping up through the air against gravity. This is kind of what's happening when a plant is pulling water up from its roots all the way up this water column and then into the leaf. So this is a process called transpiration. It is powered by evaporation. And just like the beads in a chain, these little water molecules are linked together. This is called cohesion. If you remember from Biology 1, we talked about cohesion and adhesion when we talked about properties of water. Water really likes to stick to itself, and it really likes to stick to other things as well, but mainly to itself due to those hydrogen bonds. So the water does not start to get pulled into the plant in the root. It actually starts to get pulled out of the leaf from the stoma due to evaporation. So evaporation of water from the leaves is going to pull the first water molecule from the leaf into the air. And then the second water molecule is going to get pulled from the stem into the leaf. And then the third water molecule is going to get pulled from the trunk to the stem, so on and so forth until the water is pulled through the roots. So I use the example in class. If I'm standing on top of a building with a drinking straw that's really, really tall and I try to drink from it, it's not going to work because I'm not going to be powerful enough. But due to evaporation and the narrowness of these tubes, it allows the water molecules to be pulled up by this chain reaction, much like the beads. And this causes a little bit of negative pressure and pulls new water molecules into the root. The evaporation of the water is actually really important, and most of the water that a plant so-called drinks doesn't actually power photosynthesis. Only a small portion of the water powers photosynthesis. But in order to get that small part of the water to power photosynthesis, we have to pull up and evaporate most of the rest of the water. This happens inside of the xylem. So the leaves would be up here, the roots would be down here. This is a one-way road. The xylem is kind of like a hollow tube. There's no separation between the cells, and the cells are actually dead. They have a little bit of lignin in them, or more lignin in them than normal, kind of stiffen them up. And again, those support cells will be around the outside of the xylem. The xylem is there to transport mainly water and some dissolvable minerals. Now, we also have the task of, once the leaves do produce these starches and sugars, what do we do with them? Well, the plant needs those starches throughout the whole plant in order to survive. So it needs starches in the leaves, it needs starches in the stems, and it needs starches in the roots. So we are going to use the phloem, and this phloem is going to transport basically tree sap up and down the plant. How does it do this if it doesn't have transpiration? The phloem does not use evaporation. It uses gravity essentially, and the thickness of this liquid, which is normally like a sappy liquid. It's going to have some water in it, but it's also going to have lots of sugars. It's going to have proteins. It's going to have some hormones, plant hormones, and other things inside of it that make it kind of thick and sticky, which means it's going to stick to the walls and to these sieve plates. These cells are actually alive, and the sieve plates separate each cell. And again, these sugars can transport up or down because they're kind of sticking to all the walls. And humans, we love tree sap. We use maple tree sap for syrup. We use rubber tree sap to make rubber. We love tree sap. All right, so here's a review about xylem and phloem. If this is the only thing you remember about xylem and phloem, I'll be happy. Here's a great compare and contrast. So if we are comparing and contrasting, which one is this describing? Transports waters and mineral only. It's one way only upwards. It transports in bulk flow due to a negative pressure, i.e. evaporation. The cell wall is made up of dead, hollow cells, and there are no end plates or end walls. These form in the center of the vascular bundle and has lots of lignin. So we are describing xylem. This is the xylem. Now, what about this one? It says transports foods and sugars. It has two-directional flow. It can go up or down. It mostly transports by osmosis or turgor pressure, so just absorption through the cell wall, which is why that cell wall needs to be alive. They are living, but they generally don't have a nucleus. They do have end plates, which are perforated, and we call them sieve plates. They're on the outside edge of the plant. So they're going to be on the outside of the vascular bundles if the tree has them. And it doesn't just transport sugars, it also transports proteins, amino acids, and hormones. This is the phloem, And generally the phloem is smaller than the xylem. All right. Now, guard cells are really important for transpiration. The guard cells are going to help the leaf breathe. They're on the bottom of the leaf, but I want to talk about them when we talk about xylem and phloem, because the xylem is going to never ending evaporation unless there's something to prevent the stoma from losing that water. And in this case, this is the guard cell. Here is an electron micrograph of the guard cell surrounding the stoma. The stoma, again, is going to be this open pore that allows for gas exchange and evaporation. The guard cells are kind of funny. If they dry out, if there's not a whole lot of water available, they kind of shrink and close. Here's an image of a closed stoma because the guard cell doesn't have as much water. Whereas this one is swollen with water. When it is swollen with water, it kind of opens up into this circular pattern, allowing transpiration to take place. So in a very natural way, if there's water available, the stoma will be open. If there's not water available, it will not undergo transpiration. And if it can't do transpiration, the leaf will not be undergoing photosynthesis, which becomes problematic in times of drought because the stoma become closed, photosynthesis stop, and if this lasts too long, then the plant can die. All right, we are done talking about leaves and stems. Let's talk about the roots. The roots are very interesting. They can be modified for many different purposes, but there's two main patterns, a taproot or fibrous root. And this has a pattern, like generally monocots are fibrous, generally dicots are taproots, but that's not always the case. It depends on the environment and what the needs of the tree are and the species of the tree. Okay, a single tree can't switch from one to the other. It's going to be the species of the tree. So a taproot is going to be one large central root, and it can have fibrous roots coming off the edges, whereas the fibrous root system branches more outwards and less downwards and can spread out over larger distances. Here is a type of root modification called an air root. You're going to see these in tropical areas where the air has a lot of moisture, and sometimes flooding can encourage this type of aerial root growth. This is another type of root modification that humans actually played a part in. We decided these roots were delicious, and so we kept breeding them until the roots got bigger and bigger and bigger. What kind of structural modification do you think happened with carrots and potatoes and beets? Well, this is the ground tissue of the root that has been modified to store extra starches. So these are huge, enormous taproots that have now retained all of those starches in the ground tissue. Now, let's look at what a root is. Well, a root, its main purpose is to absorb water and nutrients and minerals. So it's going to be structured that way. The point of a root is to have as much surface area as possible. So on the epidermis, or the dermal layer of the root, they're going to have these root hair cells. These are single cells that have these large projections, and the only thing that those do is increase surface area for more absorption. If it does have a symbiotic relationship with like a mycorrhizae, this is the place that it's going to attach. Underneath the epidermis is going to be the ground cells, and these are there mainly for storage of starches. But in the center of the root, of course, is going to be vascularization, so a xylem and phloem, because we're trying to suck all the water up out of the ground. We need the xylem in the root. Now, I told you earlier when we talked about stems, the plants are growing up at the same time that they're growing down, which means we have to have cell division at the tips of the roots. We call this the apical meristem. This is where lots and lots of cell division is happening. It's a very sensitive, delicate part of the root, but it's also the part of the root that's digging through the dirt. So what we end up with is a bunch of dead cells layered on top of the meristem. This kind of acts like a little fingernail or a little root cap that protects the sensitive meristem from the rocky dirt environment as it grows and pushes through the dirt. If you remember from last semester, we did a lab where we looked at a tip of a root and we saw mitosis. This is happening mainly in the meristem. And I mentioned that if you're looking for cell division up here, you're not going to find this because these are mature cells. And if you're looking for cell division down here, you're not going to find it because this is the dead cells. These are the root caps. But right here underneath the root cap is where you're going to find lots and lots and lots of cell division or mitosis. This is another image of a root. It's not any different than this one, but I liked it because it kind of showed how the epidermis changes. We have the root hair cells. You can see the xylem and the phloem in the middle of the root, and then the root cap. All right, so what is the purpose of the roots? Well, the purpose of the roots is to absorb nutrients. We want to absorb some inorganic minerals. We want to absorb organic matter like dead and dying detritus material, or even microorganisms like bacteria. The roots are going to absorb some air. We'll talk about that later because they're not really good at absorbing things from the air, so they have to have a little bit of help. But air does make up part of the soil composition. Otherwise, the plant would have a really hard time digging through it. And of course, water as well. So let's talk about soil composition. The organic material, meaning the bacteria, the dead and dying like leaves and detritus material, anything in decay, this is all organic and it is called humus. The inorganic stuff is going to be rocks and minerals. Okay, so sand is very large soil particles, little rocky particles. You can hold them in your hand and you can kind of see the grains with your eyes. You can see a single grain of sand with your eyes. Whereas silt is much finer than sand. It still is going to be loose material, but the soil particles are like 100 times smaller. Even smaller than that is clay. Now, this is what we think of. Squishy clay has a lot of water in it, but we can also dry out the clay to make like pottery. Clay has extremely fine particles. They're so fine, they just kind of stick to each other. When I'm talking about most soil composition, I'm talking about loam. Now, of course, there are places in the world that have mostly clay in their dirt, or they have mostly sand in the dirt. But most places like deciduous forests, tropical forests, they're going to have something called loam. And loam is a mixture of all these different kinds of soil. It's a mixture of humus, sand, silt, and clay. And it usually forms in these distinctive layers. So thinking about the leaves falling, those leaves lay on the ground and they die and they decompose and they become part of this top layer. It's called horizon O, and it's usually 2 or 3 inches thick, and it's made up of the most fresh organic material. It's mostly humus. The next horizon is horizon A. It still has a lot of humus in it, but it's more loam. It's going to have some other particle sizes in there as well. Then we get to horizon B, which is mostly going to be sand, silt, and clay. Not as much organic material, but it's still there. The roots are going to reach down to this area mainly to absorb water because most of its nutrient absorption is up here. Plants hardly make it down this deep, but there are, I'm sure that there are some. Horizon C is going to be your soil base. It's very rocky soil and it has mostly mineral, not as much organic material. Underneath that is going to be just pure rock. And again, take this diagram with a grain of salt, pun intended, because these depths are averages. If I go dig in my backyard and then I go dig in your backyard, we may have slightly different readings, just horizon O, horizon A, B, and C. All right, so what is the plant trying to pull out of the dirt? Well, everything that you and I need. You and I need sodium. You and I need iron. You and I need calcium and magnesium and potassium. Plants also need those things to be able to have proper metabolism. But one of the things that's hardest for them to absorb is nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is extremely abundant in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas, but plant roots are not really good at absorbing it like that, so they prefer to have it in the form of ammonia. Plants can't make ammonia out of the air. So what they do is they form a symbiotic relationship with a cyanobacteria or a soil bacteria or even a prokaryote, but some kind of nitrogen fixing bacteria. These nitrogen fixing bacteria live inside of the roots, and in the little colonies, they create these nodules. So root nodules are always going to be nitrogen fixing little symbiotic relationships. What they do is they take the nitrogen from the air that's inside of the dirt and it makes ammonia. It is so efficient at this that it not only causes the plant to have direct absorption of ammonia, but it actually will place extra ammonia back into the soil. This type of plant that has this symbiotic relationship is called a legume. The kinds of plants that are legumes are like peanuts, soybeans, lentils, peas, and even clovers. So what do you think is going on in this picture? This is a corn farmer, and corn grows extremely fast, which means it will strip all of the nutrients from the soil. If a farmer grows corn one year and corn the next year and corn the next year and corn the next year, eventually they are going to have what's called dead land. The land will have no nutrients. It'll become like the Dust Bowl. It'll become really hard for them to grow any other crops. So what they do is they're going to grow a legume next to their cash crop. And not only do they get the products of the legume, say peanuts or soybeans, but it replenishes the nutrients in the soil, fertilizing the corn. So they don't have to rotate their crops every year, they just grow them together, and then they will never worry about having dead land. Other organisms will rely on a symbiotic relationship with fungus instead of the cyanobacteria. Now, the fungus or the mycorrhizal network can help transfer nutrients, but nutrients are not the only thing that they transfer. They can also transfer plant hormones and send signals. Some of these plants that rely on the mycorrhizal for absorption of nutrients rely on them so heavily that they've lost the ability to photosynthesize. So there are some saprotrophic or saprophyte plants. They no longer produce chlorophyll. They have become completely reliant on the fungi to digest dead matter. I think that's kind of interesting. But changing topics, here is this bright yellow shipment of bananas. How do you think bananas get to the United States? Places like New York State, they don't grow bananas. It's too cold of a climate, so they have to get bananas from somewhere. And they are shipped from South America, like Colombia. How do we get a banana all the way from Colombia to New York? Because I don't know about you, but I'll buy a banana in a grocery store, bring it home, and the next day it'll be brown. It's very frustrating. So I can't imagine that they're shipping bananas after they're ripe. They would go bad too quickly. It takes a long time for these ships to reach New York. It can take them 2 and 3 weeks to get there. So what do they do? Well, they're going to ship the bananas when they're green. They're picking them when they're green. And they're not just green, unripened bananas. These are hard bananas. They're inedible. But they can last in a shipment for a month. So they can stay in a shipping container for a month and be just fine. Then right before they get to the grocery store, they are sprayed with ethylene gas in this case. And ethylene is a plant hormone that encourages ripening of fruits. Now, if the banana stayed on the tree would be producing the ethylene gas or the ethylene hormone. But since we picked them from the tree, they're no longer going to get that shock of ethylene that they normally would. So we give it to the fruit artificially. And that way we can have beautiful yellow bananas in grocery stores without them turning rotten. There are other kinds of plant hormones besides just ethylene. There's abscisic acid, which essentially does the opposite of ethylene. It actually causes dormancy of seeds. We have auxins and cytokinins. These help for cell growth, so promoting very fast growing trees and fruits. And gibberellin will actually help to break stored starches inside and help to germinate or sprout the seeds faster. So we can use these plant hormones to our advantages during farming. Here is a better picture of these plant hormones. You can go through each one of these. There are questions on the test about these plant hormones. Now, plants will respond to their environment using hormones. Again, they can send these signals through the mycorrhizal network even, but they respond to their environment with tropisms as well. Tropism is just the movement. There is different kinds of plant tropisms. Phototropism is the movement towards the sun. Now, plants can't get up and walk around, but what you'll see is that the plants will grow in the direction of the sun, or the cells in the leaves that are facing the sun will grow bigger, and the parts that are not facing the sun will not grow as quickly. There's also geotropism, where the flower or the plant will respond to gravity. This is really important because roots have to grow down, shoots have to grow up. The only way the plant knows which direction is up and down is due to gravity. We've actually done some experiments where we try to grow plants in space, and they need some sort of gravitational signal. So we can grow them in a centrifuge, but not just on the space station. There's also thigmotropism. This is a weird word, thigmotropism. Thigmotropism is response to touch. You're going to see this in climbing vines. Their roots are going to go towards where they're touching. They grow up a stalk or up a trunk. And then most plants undergo hydrotropism to some degree. This is where the roots will grow towards a source of moisture. So looking at this plant, is this an example of phototropism, thigmotropism, geotropism, or hydrotropism? So this is an example of thigmotropism. There are little trigger hairs inside of this modified leaf. It is a leaf, not a flower. And if something brushes up against it, it will snap closed. This is a response to touch. What about this one? Well, this is an example of geotropism. At some point in time, I'm guessing 50 years ago, because of the growth of these trees, there was a landslide or a flood or some kind of natural disaster that pushed all of these young saplings down. But they were young and pliable at the time, so as they continued to grow, the new growth grew upwards due to geotropism. So they have this section that was laid flat, but then they corrected, or in some cases overcorrected, and now you have this whole forest of curved trees. That's due to geotropism. It looks wacky, but it's a natural occurrence. And the most famous example is phototropism, where plants will grow towards the sun. All right. I know it's been a long lecture, but let's get through it. We have to talk about how plants reproduce, and each different type of plant has a different system. So some of these non-vascular plants, these spore-producing plants, are going to alternate between a gametophyte life cycle and a sporophyte life cycle. The generations will alternate. So a gametophyte plant can only produce sporophyte spores, and a sporophyte plant can only produce the gametophyte spores. So the gametophyte will actually produce a zygote, and then that plant grows and produces these gametophyte haploid spores. But both of them can grow into a full plant, because plants don't really need to be zygotic or diploid. Here is another interesting thing is that some of them can actually swim. These little zygotes can actually swim. And they look like sperm and they swim through water like sperm, but you're going to see that more in your bryophytes. The pteridophytes also go through this alternating life cycle. So the ferns and the mosses will both go through an alternating life cycle between a gametophyte, which is only haploid, and a sporophyte, which is diploid. Here you can see an image of it looks like a liverwort, and you can see the sporophyte as well as the gametophyte part of the plant. All right, what about conifers? These are gymnosperms. Conifers were, part of this great race to become super duper tall. So some of these conifer trees can grow to enormous heights, and they gain an advantage by growing really tall because they absorb more sunlight, but they can also disperse their seeds better. Imagine that this tree right here was producing seeds and they just dropped directly onto the ground. They probably wouldn't grow because they would be in competition with the parent. This parent would be producing too much shade for the babies to grow. So they came up with these cones, and the cones, each scale on the cone can develop into a seed. And the seed has a leaf attached to it, and it kind of catches the wind and floats on the wind. So being really tall and producing these cone scale like leaves can help them to travel long distances. Now, conifers are going to have male and female cones. Sometimes the male and the female are on the same plant, the same individual. But sometimes you have a male plant and a female plant separate. There's no rules. Nature is wild. Let's just go with a plant that has both male and female parts on the same tree. The female cone will look distinctively different than the male cone because the male cone, it will be smaller and more compact. Its purpose is to produce pollen, and this pollen can come in huge clouds of pollen. If the tree gets shaken or a large wind comes by when it's ready to pollinate, this pollen will just fill the air. Some of that pollen may get inside of the scales of the female cone. If this pollen gets inside of the scales of the female cone, it can fertilize this little seed or this ovule, and then it will develop into a zygotic seed. There's going to be two little zygotes inside of the seed, and it is attached to a scale on this cone. As the cone dries out, the scales get wider and wider, and then when they drop, they can produce a seedling or a sapling. All right. Why do you think angiosperms evolved flowers and fruits? This is the same diagram as earlier, but you can see that conifers were around and had seeds for a really, really long time before flowers were produced. But flowers were developed in co-evolution with insects or pollinators. It was kind of this race to have the most attractive, vibrant flowers because pollinators would come spread the pollen, whereas conifers are completely reliant on the wind, which is not super reliable. Sometimes it's windy and sometimes it's not. They have to have wind at the exact right time that the pollen cones are ready to release pollen. So the flowers kind of fixed that problem. Not only did it produce a nice safe space for the ovule or the seeds to produce, but it attracted pollinators so they didn't have to rely on the wind. Then they also developed fruits, and fruits allowed larger animals to eat the seeds, swallow the seeds, and then as those animals migrated large distances, they would poop the seeds out, allowing these plants to spread all over the world. A seed is very unique. It is an embryo that is protected by this seed coat, and it also has lots of nutrients or a food supply for this embryo, the seed. And like we mentioned earlier, they're going to have the cotyledon. Monocots will have one cotyledon, which is this little leaflet, and dicots will have two cotyledons. These, this is the general life cycle of a flower. This looks like a lily to me. We have, I'm so sorry. I had a brain. So there are male and female parts within the same plant. When we're talking about flowers, it's going to be male and female there right together next to each other. The pollen is on top of this little filament, and it is going to be kind of like a sperm. The pollen is literally just a hard coating surrounding the sperm. when the pollen lands on this sticky stigma right here on top of the style, it will actually grow what's called a pollen tube. The pollen tube, it's wild, guys. It will grow all the way down into the ovule. When the pollen tube grows into the ovule, the sperm will travel down the pollen tube and fertilize the ovule, which will in turn turn into a seed now that it has a whole embryo, a whole zygote. Then this, if it is a fruit producing body, this will grow into a fruit, protecting those seeds. If not, it turns into, well, the seed. That plants have different strategies for dispersing their seeds, but this little ovary sac there. All right. Yeah, here we can see the pistil. You can see the pollen on top of the pistil and the ovule. This is just a different diagram. You have to have the gametophyte. The sperm cells have to fertilize the ovule for them to produce into seeds. All right, that is it for today. Don't forget your chapter laboratory write-up. The video will be posted very soon. Your chapter homework is an optional drag and drop activity, and please do not forget to take your chapter quiz by 5 p.m. on Friday. Y'all have a wonderful day.